I think so. Let's go ahead. My name is Lindsay Forbes from the RDS Southeast, and I'm just here to introduce you to this third social care webinar that the RDS Southeast has run. Thank you very much for coming, everybody. We're delighted to welcome Professor Julie Beadle Brown, Intellectual and Development, and she's going to tell us today about social care research involving adults with intellectual disability. But before we begin, we have a few things, housekeeping things to say. I'll just wait, I've just seen a couple of more people joining. Okay, so I'm just going to say we'll be locking the Zoom very soon so that we don't get interrupted. And please would everybody mute their microphones and during the actual delivery of the workshop, though obviously we will unmute you. We'd like you to unmute for asking questions towards the end. If your internet reception is unstable, then sometimes it's a good idea to turn off your video. Does the trick if you're not receiving very good sound. We'll be recording the webinar, okay, so that it can be viewed later on our website. And during Julie's presentation, if you would like to ask some questions, put them in the chat, and then and so that while it's fresh in your mind, that's fine. And then what we'll do after about 30 minutes, we will stop, have a look at the questions, and ask people to and select, then we can sort of work out whether there are sort of commonalities, so we don't ask the same question lots of times, but we will ask people to deliver their question at that point. So there'll be a short break of a minute while we just regroup on which questions to ask. So I think at this point, if we're all ready, we can lock the Zoom, and we would like to welcome again Julie Beadle Brown. Go ahead, Julie.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. It's my pleasure to be here today and have the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about social care research involving adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Of course, there is many things we could say about this area, and so I'm going to pull out some of the things that I think are key that we've learned over the years from the work that we do. The presentation isn't going to be kind of heavy with references and things like that, but anything that, if you would like any further information, that my email address will be at the end, and obviously the PowerPoints will be available, the PDF of the PowerPoint will be available for people afterwards. So please do get in touch if there's anything you'd like more information about from the things that I say. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see the presentation. So I'm going to talk very briefly about the needs and characteristics of people with intellectual disabilities, with a particular focus on those that can impact on our ability to do research, for example. I will give an overview of some of the research methodologies that have been used in the field and some of the issues and solutions, and I'll look at some methodological issues, some practical issues, and some ethical issues that have come up. And then I'll finish with hopefully a little summary of some of the things that we've learned we need in terms of ensuring the meaningful participation of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, both as participants and also as stakeholders, members of advisory groups, and also as researchers themselves. But obviously I'll just do that very briefly at the end. So, who are people with intellectual and developmental disabilities? Some of you will know this very well, but just to kind of recap. So intellectual disability, or more commonly in this country referred to as learning disability. So in policy, in English policy, in UK policy, we generally use learning disability. Internationally and in the research field, the term intellectual disability is normally used. And intellectual disability refers to people who generally have an intellectual capacity, an IQ less than 70, and also have severe impairments in at least 2 areas of functioning. And their impairment, their disability, is present before the year 18 years of age. That's the kind of clinical official definition, if you like, of intellectual disability. Of course, people can have a whole range within that, from profound and multiple disabilities right through to mild and even sometimes you might hear the term borderline. So people whose IQ might fall between 70 and 80 are sometimes referred to as borderline intellectual or learning disabilities. And then we have the wider term of developmental disabilities. And this has primarily come from the US, but we tend to use it in an international context as well. And this is the Centre for Disease Control in the USA, CDC, use the following definition. So it's a group of conditions which are due to an impairment in physical, learning, language, or behavior areas. These conditions begin during the developmental period, may impact day-to-day functioning, and usually last throughout a person's lifetime. So that's effectively a much broader definition. And the most common kind of developmental disability, and the one that we do most of our work in alongside learning disability, is autism. And that's the area that we'll often come across in our field. Of course, it also covers other conditions like ADHD, dyspraxia, other specific learning difficulties, any of those other kind of elements that may have arisen when during the developmental period. So what are some of the key characteristics that can impact on people's involvement in research? Well, first of all, and probably the one that most people will think about, is issues with communication. So you will have some people with intellectual disabilities who may not communicate verbally, they may not speak, or they may not use, for example, any formal sign language to speak. That doesn't mean they don't communicate. They may have lots of other ways of communicating, but actually they may not communicate in a way that's easy for us to necessarily understand, especially as strangers, especially as somebody who doesn't know them well. Some may not even understand verbal or sign communication, so they may not be understanding or processing verbal information. Some people may be able to talk, may be able to understand, but have more subtle issues in understanding communication, particularly, for example, those who are autistic, who may have more difficulties with, for example, more abstract constructs, thinking about things like feelings or how they their experiences and being able to express those. And sometimes also very common is that that in English we have many ways of speaking that cannot be understood if you understand things literally. We are probably one of the worst languages in the world for sayings. And we don't even know we're doing it half the time. Sometimes we say things. I often send a message to a friend, oh, I'm just hopping in the shower. What does that mean? I'm standing on one leg and jumping up and down in the shower? Yeah. We have to think about sometimes how we speak and how we say things, because actually many times the things we say, we need some inner code. We need some deeper code or decoding machine that allows us to understand. And it's not just phrases like a rolling stone gathers no moss, or those strange proverbs that we tend to have, but they're everyday phrases like you need to pull your socks up, you know, or and say, well, but my socks are up. I'm not wearing any socks. You know, if you have a little understanding, those things might cause you some difficulties. And we have to think about that when we're writing information sheets, etc., when we're presenting, when we're doing interviews. There are many examples of things that, and they usually come across as funny because you realize what you've said. When I'm training staff to work with people, particularly autistic people, I usually say to, or when I'm working with families, I usually say, if somebody does something that seems a bit odd, it's probably because you told them to without realizing. And so the same goes for us as researchers. So communication is something we have to think about. And the levels of difficulty with communication, of course, will vary from very severe to more subtle and not so noticeable when you first meet somebody, perhaps. Of course, particularly in people with intellectual disabilities, with learning disabilities, people may have difficulties with cognitive functioning. So they may not be able to understand more complex concepts. They may be prone to, for example, acquiescence, saying yes to everything when you ask them a question. for example, or not understanding, again, abstract concepts. They also may find it very difficult to make comparisons. So if you want to ask them a question as to whether they, for example, prefer where they live now to where they used to live, they may find that really difficult, because that requires them to hold information in their head about two different things. And whether they can make those comparisons will be down to cognitive ability. And then, of course, for some people, they won't actually be able to engage directly in research processes, because the severity of their cognitive impairments are so great that actually interviewing or filling in questionnaires, their ability to engage in conversation is severely limited. So actually, we have to find alternative ways, and we'll come to that shortly. For some people, they have difficulties with sensory functioning, and this is particularly important for autistic people. So they may have difficulties processing information of particular types, or they may have sensory sensitivities. And that can impact greatly on things like the environment we choose to do research in, never mind things like their quality of life and how they feel about their lives. But it can be people can misunderstand information, but they can also, for example, get very easily distracted. So for example, if you're asking them questions and something's going on outside, they may not be able to listen to your questions, for example. And I say many people may have difficulties with noises, smells, and we have to think about those if we want to make our environment as accessible as possible, our research environment, if we're actually, although at the minute we don't have that problem because we can't go anywhere near anybody because of COVID, but in the days when maybe we can actually meet people face to face again, those kind of things are really, can be really important. The other things that are really important to know and to remember is that often people, particularly people with intellectual disabilities, have very limited experiences, limited life experiences. Quite often they haven't experienced lots of different opportunities and things that give us the means to make choices or the ways to make comparisons. In some of the very early research in this field around, for example, deinstitutionalization, so around closing institutions, institutions and hospitals and setting up community-based services, people, when you just ask people, would you like to move to the community? People would often say, no, I don't want to do that. But of course, once they move to the community and experience what it's like, if you say, would you like to go back to the institution? Generally, they'll say, nuh-uh. Because of course, when you ask them the first time, they don't know what the option is, so therefore they can't make comparisons. So we have to often think about that. Many people that we work with, particularly people with autism, people with intellectual disabilities, have very traumatic experiences. And of course, so therefore we have to be very aware when we do research in this field that we don't cause additional harm. So sometimes just thinking about sensitive topics, things that have happened to people, just sometimes asking them about the time when they had really bad support can be actually very traumatic and bring back memories that they find difficult. So again, we have to think about the fact that many people will have had, perhaps been restrained, will have had physical interventions used with them, for example, and those can be very traumatic and very difficult. Many people will be bullied, will have been bullied in their childhood, bullied at school, bullied in adulthood, harassment, victimization, etc. And those can be very traumatic experiences that can come up that you have to sometimes think about. Even when you sometimes think your research isn't looking at an area that's particularly difficult or sensitive, you have to sometimes think a little bit outside the box and think, oh, actually, hold on a minute. If I start to talk about that, that might be difficult for them. Okay. And then the other thing that can happen is that, particularly for autistic people, but actually for everybody, for all of us in some respects, there are very high levels of anxiety and fear. For autistic people, we know that they experience very high levels of anxiety and stress, and the need for predictability and consistency is really strong. So we have to think a lot about how we present information, how we prepare people, for example, and what the questions, how we question people in order to help them to understand. I'll come to some of the strategies shortly. But there's another thing that actually we've come across quite frequently, and that is when we're asking people particularly about social care, about support, about services, about staff, is that people are afraid. People are afraid very frequently to tell the truth, to talk openly, because they're afraid of people getting into trouble. They want to please people, for example, or sometimes they have a fear of losing a place that they've got, or a service that they've got, or a staff member that they do like, if they complain. And actually this is true also for families. We have for families of people with intellectual disabilities. Just to illustrate, I'll give you one example. So a study we did years ago on out of area placements, and we interviewed families and we interviewed people themselves where we could, and we obviously visited services and we looked at the quality of services and things like that where people were placed. And families would often say that everything was, when we'd ask them, so how are things? Oh, it's brilliant there, it's great, they have great support. And then we would ask the question a different way, and we said, well, if you could change anything, what would you change? You know, is there anything you'd change? If you were the manager, what would you change? And they would come up with very simple things like, well, it'd be really nice if they had some toilet roll. Or maybe wearing their own clothes when I come to visit, not somebody else's. That would be quite nice, wouldn't it? And I'm going, those are pretty basic things that were issued, that were issues in the large institutions. You know, but they didn't feel that they could complain, partly because they fought really hard to get this place because they thought it was going to be good. So there's lots of things that go on in the background that might dictate some of the things that these people have experienced and their families over time that may affect how they can engage in research. Okay, so this group is we often talk about groups that are hard to reach, and this is one of these groups that are hard to reach. You would think they might be easy to reach because they should be using services, but actually we find that there's lots of gatekeeping, and particularly in some areas, lack of desire to be involved in services. And sometimes it's not a lack of desire, it's just a lack of capacity. You know, where they're short-staffed and there's nobody will read the letter or take the phone call. You phone back 100 times to get somebody to see whether they might pass on some information to somebody, and that can be quite hard. So they're hard to reach, often for practical reasons, and in that sense. The other reason is that those living with families or independently can be hard to find, especially if they're not in contact with any services. So they may be hard. People seem to disappear at age 18. They're known to children's services, but if their needs aren't great enough to be receiving adult care, then they may well disappear off the ends of the earth. There are substantial ethical and research governance approval systems needed to go through, especially if you want to include people who may lack capacity to consent to participation. So that can sometimes put people off. Even including or trying to include these people. And sometimes it's hard to get the needed advice related to, for example, consent or involvement. So that we generally find that there's a lack of understanding of the Mental Capacity Act out there and the implications for people taking part in research. Sometimes people don't have a personal consultee, somebody who can advise, who knows them well, like a family member. And sometimes it's hard to find or make contact with somebody who's been nominated as a consultee. So there are lots of practical issues in that. And sometimes the funding sources that we can apply to for work in this area are not as big as maybe in some other areas, and therefore funding can often be a bit limited in order to really include this group, because we might need to use alternative means, and I'll come back to that. So if they're hard to reach and hard to engage, why should we include them? Why should we include people with intellectual developmental disabilities? Well, actually, they are already the most excluded, marginalized group in society, and they have a right to be included. So there's a moral issue in the sense of making sure that our research, whatever research we're doing, doesn't inadvertently exclude people in this group, as well as making sure we're trying to do research that sets out to include people specifically and to do work in this field. There is already, there is a lack of research related to social care for this population. Actually, especially those who have a developmental disability such as autism, but don't have a learning disability, where actually they don't get very much in the way of services, but actually they're still extremely vulnerable and can end up in the mental health system or this criminal justice system without the right social care support. And there is a couple of recent reviews that we've done that just highlights. It's one of those reviews you do where you know the findings before you do the research, because we knew there wasn't hardly any research, but we had to do the research. We had to do the systematic review to show that actually there was almost no social care research related to autism, for example. There's a little bit more related to intellectual disability, learning disability per se, and actually what research there is shows that social care is really not very good. And if people are interested, I can send you examples of research into, for example, the quality and the nature of the care that this group of people receive. And of course, there's another kind of, I guess, a moral, but also a very pragmatic reason. If we can get our social care systems to provide good outcomes, physical, emotional well-being, inclusion, choice and control, etc., i.e. quality of life, for this group, then we can do it for just about anybody else. Because this group is the hardest group to provide good support for, because they're the group that needs the most support in general and the most intensive support. If we can do it well, then we can do it well for everybody. And we generally say if we can get things right for autistic people, they'll work for everybody. So there's a policy and a practical reason for why we should do research in this area. So in terms of the types of methods that have been used, some of you, I'm sure, I know some of you already do research in social care from the list of participants as you join, and so some of you will have lots of experience with these already. But we have, for example, a whole range of different ways of working in terms with interviews and focus groups. And generally, these have been used to get people's experiences and views about things, you know, sort of what is their life like? What are their experiences in particular areas? What do they think about this or that kind of thing? And obviously, they generally are face-to-face or nowadays on Zoom or whatever technology we can get to work with people. And they can be really helpful, and obviously they give a really nice kind of qualitative view in terms of people's lives and experiences. Okay, questionnaires ultimately can give a wider view as well, and you can get more information. You can have some more often have more rating scales as part of those, maybe get some numerical or quantitative data. And they're often used to look at things like quality of life, service satisfaction, and there are and in fact Kent has been very much involved, particularly at PSSRU and Tizard, in things like the Adult Social Care Survey, which includes an easy read version that councils can send out to get information, and that's a questionnaire basically. I'll come back to some of the issues with these shortly. And then the other type of method that has been used and that we use frequently, and it's not used very much because it's hard to do, but and that's observations. So that's actually conducting observations, and these are usually structured observations which may, for example, record exactly what might be happening or what is going on, or counting things, but also longer observations that allow us to then rate, for example, people's quality of life or their quality of support, the environment. We even, in one of the projects we did years ago, it used to be called the QMF MOPSU study, it became known, but basically it was a study around care homes, and we even had an observational measure of pain. Now, obviously, we had to find out some information about people before we could do it, but we watched to see whether people showed any signs of being in pain, and then whether staff noticed that and were responding, for example. So you can observe a whole range of things. We also observe leadership. How are managers leading their staff, for example, in services? How are they coaching? Are they modeling? Are they helping people, giving feedback, for example? Okay, and this is a method some of you will probably know, remember Jim Mansell, and Jim wrote a review in 2010, I think it was, for the School of Social Care Research on the use of observational methods. So if anybody's, and it's about the benefits, the reasons, and some of the difficulties and the ways of overcoming those. And so that is an area that, and how important it is in the field of intellectual disability, and in terms of giving an idea of people's lived experiences. And I'll say a little bit more in just a second. Now, of course, sometimes we can't involve people directly, and the other methods that have been used have been informant interviews and questionnaires. So, for example, families might talk about what happens and what support people get, etc. Support staff might be asked to fill in information about what people do, how they spend their time, the choices that they have, etc. All of those kind of things. And those are slightly different from what we call proxy interviews or questionnaires. So the informant interviews are usually asking people about facts, about what is the situation. Proxy interviews are usually used around things like quality of life or satisfaction, where you're asking, what do you think the person would write? What do you think the person would say? And so there's a range of those, particularly around quality of life areas. And then other things that have been used that are more indirect has been, for example, looking at the way that people's plans are written, the paperwork around individuals, their files, the support that they get, reviewing their person-centered plan, for example, to look at how meaningful it is, whether it's different from everybody else's in the service, all of those kinds of things in that sense. Okay, so those are some of the things that in this field you will see used in the different research. And of course, I've just picked out a few examples there. Okay, so let's think about some of the issues that we come across. So when it comes to things like interviews, focus groups, and surveys or questionnaires, generally these can only be used with some people, because actually you need a relatively high cognitive and communication level in order to do an interview, in order to be interviewed, and in order to fill in a measure, a survey, for example. So interviews and focus groups and surveys are not usually possible to use with people with more severe learning disabilities, where their communication, or autism, where their communication levels are lower. Okay, now there are many tools that help us to involve as many people as possible. Some of you may have heard of talking mats, and talking mats is a way of facilitating people to understand better and to have easier ways to respond when we want to ask them questions about their life, about their preferences, about the quality of their life, etc. But you still need a reasonable cognitive level to process the demand or the request to say whether something is good, not good, or not sure. Yeah, so there's still some issues, you still need something to do there. Another issue that we found, and this is very interesting to work on, and we've done quite a lot of this work in the past, where we've tried to develop adapted measures, often called easy read measures of tools and of questionnaires and of surveys. And actually these are often very much needed for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. But the thing is that the adaptations needed often vary from person to person, or from subgroup to subgroup. So, and it's really hard to get something that works for everyone. I'll give you a quick example. So we were trying to develop the easy read version of the adult social care survey and the ASCOT tools, and the adult social care observation toolkit. We were trying to get to an easy read version, and we did lots of focus groups with different groups of people. And when we would just get a consensus from one group, we would present that to the next group, and they would go, no, that picture doesn't mean that to me. That picture means something else to me. So sometimes we have to just be aware that we're trying to get it as good as we can, but it may not always work for everyone, because because we're so much individuals, and how people process information is individual. Okay. Sometimes the needed adaptations may make the original measure invalid. So research has found that for people with learning disabilities, a 3-point response scale is that is much more reliable for them to be able to answer, to respond to. Once you go up to a 5-point, or even worse, a 7-point, they generally can't distinguish between the different points on the scale in most of the research. However, some measures, such as, what was an example, the EQ5D, people know what the EQ5D is. I'm sure in most of your fields you've come across it. That measure is a 5-point scale, and you're not allowed to adapt that to a 3-point scale, which means that measure can't really be used with people who only really respond well to a 3-point scale. So we have to think about those kinds of things. It's interesting, we've had some experience with ethics committees who are okay with informant interviews, but often have a lot of difficulties with proxy interviews. They would not let us ask carers, family carers, certain questions in certain ways, where it was asking them to think about what the person might like or what the person might say. So we sometimes have, now of course other times it's been okay and we've been able to do proxy interviews, but proxy interviews, the reliability information on proxy interviews is rather mixed, depending on the type of question that you're asking or the sort of focus that you have. There are many factors, as we mentioned earlier, that can impact on how people might respond. Response biases, just trying to please you. They want to make, they want you to like them. They want you to be happy. And so they might say what they think you want to hear. And also fear aspects can impact on that. And then sometimes the impact or presence of help or the help of supporters can impact on how people respond. So people might want a staff member present, but that themselves, or a family member, but that might then limit what they might be willing to say, for example, in an interview. Or they might need help to complete a survey, and then you don't know who has actually completed it, how much help did they get. So there's all of those things that we have to think about. And then just briefly about observations. Observations are really key if we want to capture the lived experience of those with more severe disabilities or communication challenges. And it's really important for looking at the quality of support and services for this group of people. However, you do have to persuade the ethics committee that it is necessary to include those who lack capacity, which is what this group will often be. And of course, we have to be aware there are also observation biases. It needs a lot of time, presence in services, travel expenses, and obviously observers need to be trained and need to pay attention to reliability. So it's not straightforward to do observations, although we generally find that the benefits outweigh the costs in terms of the nature of the data that we get around people's lives and people's experiences. And then some ethical issues. Obviously, if you want to include people who lack capacity, just like in most fields, then you would have to get approval through the health research approval process and the Social Care Research Ethics Committee or an NHS Ethics Committee. And again, you have to be able to persuade them. That's why the research has to include people who lack capacity. And we often try to say, but we're trying to be inclusive, and they go, that's not good enough. And we have a problem sometimes with this because we think actually there is an issue about making sure we include people, but often they want you to argue why it can't just be done on people who can have capacity. If you have to be able to argue that. And of course you have to carefully consider consent processes. One of the things we meet is who will try to gain informed consent in the first place and assess whether the person has the capacity to consent. That's a big issue we come across. If we do it as researchers, we meet some issues. If we ask staff to do it, we meet different issues. If we ask families to do it, we meet different issues. The letters you have to send out, the information sheets have to be massively long because you have to outline all the processes that have to be used. If people don't have capacity, then we have to try and identify a personal consultee. If they don't have a family member or a friend who can act as a personal consultee, then we have to find a nominated consultee who can't be somebody who will be involved in the research in any other way. So if you need the staff to be involved in any way, then it can't be them. And ideally, they need not to have some sort of vested interest in the research. Who will contact the consultees? Who would have? So there's quite a lot of things we have to think about. And over the years, we've developed at Tizard, you know, kind of quite a process of okay, this seems to be what gets us through ethical approval, and so we, you know, we have quite good processes, and of course it's important. We had an ethics committee in Tizard Centre before so any of the higher level ethics committees ever existed, and before any other part of the university had an ethics committee, and so the experience of doing that has been, you know, kind of quite fruitful, I think, in terms of being able to support people in that way. Okay, last three things just to summarize. What do we need to ensure meaningful participation? Well, they won't surprise you. They're not rocket science. The first one is time. And of course, so we have to allow enough time. We have to give people enough time to think about participation, and if they need to get help to read and understand the information we send them. They need time and opportunity to ask questions about the research. We often have to factor in time to get consultee agreement, which can take quite a long time. Some of you who've worked in this field will know how hard sometimes it is. We need to allow extra time for their participation in interviews, time to respond to questions, time for breaks, time sometimes to just reschedule to a completely different day. Sometimes working in services, it can be really difficult. You can turn up and nobody's expecting you. I'm always quite reassured when they won't let me in. When they're not expecting you and they let you in anyway, that's a little bit more worrying sometimes. But you know, following up, lots of time to chase, get consent, find things. And then of course, if you're trying to include people in advisory or steering groups, or actually in collecting data, of course you need time to prepare them, time to train people, time to help them to understand what the meeting's going to be about, what their role is going to be, etc. Okay. We also need support. That can be right from really clear, easy to read, well-structured information presented in writing, in addition to verbally if appropriate. Yeah, and generally people need different formats of help available, different formats of support available to them to use as a way, in whichever way. So maybe things presented in video can be helpful for some people to listen to, or an audio at the same time as reading, for example, in that sense. There is very little good guidance around the use of pictures, whether they're pictograms or whether they're photos or whatever, because it's so individual. And it's, you know, and sometimes it can help, and sometimes the pictures can be as misleading as the words, and so you have to really test them out and check and ask different people, could this be really badly misunderstood, for example. So people need support to understand what is required and to give informed consent where at all possible. One of the things we find that really helps, especially for autistic participants, but is to have the information in advance in terms of, for example, information about a photo of who's going to be interviewing them, where they're going to be interviewed or what they're going to be doing, the questions for the interview and for the focus groups, etc. Having those in advance can often help people to prepare and to be ready and to be less anxious about participating, for example, and more likely to say yes if they know they're going to get those a little bit in advance. You may need or want a supporter to be present, but you obviously have to be aware of the potential impact. Although it can be very important to have somebody at least outside or around if you're doing research into a potentially upsetting topic, because people might need support. And actually people often will need, even if they're able to take part, they may need support just for travel or to get to a venue, and you have to think about that as well. Preparing for advisory group meetings, training to be a researcher or with a co-researcher to collect data, especially at the beginning, for example, has been found to be really important. And as I say, sometimes people will actually need physical help to get to research meetings or venues or wherever they're doing. And then, of course, time and support, add them together and you get money. Or you need money. And of course, sometimes we need to be able to pay people directly. We might need to pay for support for somebody to attend with them. You may need additional researcher time. often you might need to make sure that the grants have a little bit more leeway in them to really allow people to be involved. And sometimes we have to pay organizations to help with the recruitment, to get through the gatekeeping or the lack of capacity within organizations in order for us to get people involved and to actually get, reach as many people as possible. Okay, so I'll stop there and we'll take any questions if there are any. If there's time at the end, I'll share one case study example, one project example, but I think we'll take questions first and see what people would like to ask.
While we're waiting for people to have a think about what questions they'd like to ask, I'm very interested in this question of consent. It must be very, very difficult. I mean, it's difficult enough with people who do not have intellectual disability. Do you ever get a situation, I mean, I'm sure you do, you get situations where, somebody is judged by somebody to have capacity to consent, but then there is disagreement, or indeed the individual concerned may change their mind or and not quite register what they've consented to. This is the problem, isn't it? And then
yeah, absolutely.
The family members might disagree. It's very difficult.
No, it is very difficult. I mean, you have to be really, well, there's two rules we found. One is that you go with the person's done. So you go with there in the sense of, so even if somebody, so in our case, and obviously we're doing observational work quite frequently, which can be quite intrusive, but if we get consent, if somebody, it won't even be consent, will it? Because if a consultee gives us advice, yeah, because they're not consenting, they're giving advice. If the consultee gives us advice and it's okay to go ahead and we start the observations and it's clear the person doesn't want us there, we leave. We take any behavioral or verbal or any indication, and even if staff say they're really not happy with you here, we will trust that. We will say, I mean, of course, sometimes staff will tell us that because they don't want us there, but we have to trust, we have to say that's it, and then we'll say, okay, it's not a problem. And sometimes they just need a break, or we need to go away for a little while and come back, but sometimes it's like, no, we don't want you here, leave. It's actually very rare. People love us there to do research because actually we're the most interesting thing in their environment very often. One of the things we have to be careful about is reactivity when we're observing, because actually they come up and want to talk to us because we're interesting and we're novel, and they're not doing anything else in many cases. But you're right. But the other thing is, the thing that we find is sometimes we will get people who will say they can consent, and it's clearly they don't want to, or they, we get there and we think, I don't think he filled the form in himself, kind of thing. But sometimes we get the other situation where we had one study where we only were including people with severe and profound intellectual disabilities and complex needs. And my research worker contacted me one day, and she texted me, and I knew she was on a visit, and she said, I think I'm going to leave the service. And I said, are you all right? He said, yes. She says, but the gentleman has taken the last hour to explain to me how he manages the website for the Green Party and all the activities he takes part. He says, I don't think he meets the research criteria. So they misunderstood his level of ability. They said he didn't. He was very severely disabled. He couldn't do that. And so they got agreement and did it the other way. And we turned up and went, okay, he was very happy. It wasn't that he didn't want to take part, but he didn't meet the criteria. So there are a range of issues in terms of people knowing about the capacity and the level of ability of people sometimes. And then sometimes there are people who will be said, oh no, well, yeah, he can decide everything. He can decide that. And then you get there and you go, I'm not sure he filled the form in himself, kind of thing. So there are issues there. But we always go with the rule in the work that we do. If it looks like people aren't happy, or if people are saying at any point, no matter who has given, no matter how many times they said yes beforehand, or how many times other people have said yes, they'll be fine, we say, okay, no worries, and we just stop. basically.
Adam Webb has a question. Adam, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, Adam. Yes.
Hi, Julie. Thanks for a really comprehensive presentation. Thank you. I just want to to bring some of my experience from working in adult social care and co-production, and so I think there's some crossover there. One of the experiences I have of doing co-production is that it's a bit of a mythical beast. Everyone talks about it, but you very rarely see good examples of it. And one of the reasons for that, well, there's lots of reasons in my view for that. One of which you highlighted in your 3 points is that it takes time, it takes money, and it's often a big upfront investment in that regard. And often policy environments are very fast moving, and actually what I experience happens is instead of doing proper co-production, people go to the usual suspects. So they use their existing people. So what you tend to get is, here's a black man in a wheelchair, therefore he must represent the views of black men in wheelchairs, for example. That kind of lazy kind of approach. Also people who are easy to engage with. So people who might not say anything contentious, might be articulate, etc. And what I tend to see is rather than casting the net wide, you tend to see the same people, and they almost become experts at giving their input. So anyway, I've given enough background there, but obviously in academia, there's more rigor required. You can't just ask the same half a dozen people because they're your go-to group.
Yep.
So how do you address that in terms of getting a good representative sample that perhaps includes people who are quite critical, quite difficult to work with, and how do you stop that kind of tokenism, for want of a better word?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And of course that is something we have to factor in, is to make sure that, especially even with focus groups or interviews, that we're not just going to the same people. I mean, there are some things that some groups that we might include, but we would always go broader than that group. So I'll give you an example. So in Kent, we have Advocacy for All as an organization. So sometimes we would make sure we invited them to be part of it, but we wouldn't just invite them. We would make sure we were going much more broader. And you have to think about that. Where have people come from? What experiences do they have? Now, sometimes, I was going to say beggars can't be choosers. Sometimes it is, especially for things where it's interviews and focus groups, you are asking for volunteers. And therefore, you have to be really careful as you write up and as you analyze the data to also consider the impact that there might be if there is any bias in the sample. But to start with, we try very hard to recruit from a range of different sources so that it's not, and we also try to not over-research particular groups of people for their benefit, not from the research perspective. So we do sometimes find, and we do work in schools and things as well, and we find that the same skills get asked over and over and over and over and over again. And they get fed up. They don't want to do it anymore, kind of thing. So, it is important to do that. And it depends on the nature of the research, of course. So if it's more qualitative, it's, we were trying to gain, we're inviting people from as wide a range as possible. If it's quantitative, so if we're surveying and we need a bigger sample, then we're looking much more representative. We're trying to include everybody within a particular sample. Of course, still it'll be volunteers. People still have to click on the link or fill in the survey or whatever it might be. But we try to go much broader than that and get as many people as we can to take part. But a really core thing when we write it up is that we have to be very good at thinking about the issues, thinking about the limitations of what we've done, whether and hopefully not because we didn't try, but because actually life is life, unfortunately, and some things kind of interfere, like COVID and various things like that mean that certain things can't happen or we can't do things in a particular way. But you're right, and you're right, it is very hard to do really good co-production, and most of us don't do it in most of our lifetime very well. And I'm not sure, it's not necessarily I absolutely agree that we should be involving people in research, and we should be building the research questions from what people want us to do. But there is another side too, which is about wider issues and about policy issues and about systems issues that sometimes we also have to think about and then come back to people and say, so what do you think? So we might have to generate some ideas and then consult, as opposed to it the other way around. But you're right, it is that time, and we have to factor that in at the beginning. And most funding bodies are getting better at wanting engagement. They insist now that you have public engagement. Patient PPI was I can't say it in full. Patient and public involvement, that's what it is. And I think that's a good thing. And you have to think about how you're going to engage people at different elements of the research process. How they informed the application, how they were involved in the development of the application. And you won't get funding very much now if you haven't done a good job on that. So I think the systems are helping to make it better, but as researchers, we still have a responsibility to make sure that it's not, and we use the word in self-advocacy too, of the elite self-advocates. So the people that we bring them in as their role as our token person, and that's, we can't do that. We must involve a wider range of people. Does that answer, Adam? Does that comment on?
Yeah, no, that's really useful, and I found it particularly encouraging that there's more recognition that it takes effort and time.
Yeah, and you are supposed to request funding for engagement in most grants now. They expect to see it.
To sort of do that meaningfully rather than as a kind of a tick box type exercise.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Julie.
You're very welcome.
Do we have any other questions? Frida Mould. Please go ahead.
Hello, hi, thanks very much for that really interesting session. I'm actually in the process of doing some PPI with a group of young adults with learning disabilities, and I've had kind of various experiences working across kind of a multidisciplinary team.
Yep.
In terms of the original plan had to change because it was going to be kind of a face-to-face interaction, but due to COVID, obviously that's had to change quite radically.
Yep.
And now I'm taking on more of a, it's more of a kind of, not a diary so much, but more of a, just asking just a few questions about their experiences, but with the support of their carer or their family member. Would that still be seen as kind of an adequate approach to PPI, even though it is remote and it's like a booklet, it's like a booklet approach, and where people can post their replies back to me?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's still anything that is about getting the involved, where you're asking for people's views about the process, about the questions around the analysis, anything that, at that sense will be your PPI at some point. And of course, the only thing that you probably have to consider, and it's okay because it's, in reality, is it more a joint family and young person kind of consultation? How much is it the young person and how much is the family helping kind of thing? But I think that's still PPI, and that would still be, in my view, very much valued. And you would just be thinking about it in the sense of sort of just being aware that in some cases that it might be both the family's voice and the young person's voice is being reflected potentially if they're getting support. But that would certainly be, in that sense, as engagement. That that's a good, it's a good way of adapting to the situation that we've had.
Yeah. I have got one question on there about whether it's a question and they can either write words or they could draw a picture, so they've got a choice about how they respond to the question. But I have included one question about whether they did it alone or whether they had a support from someone. So I'm hoping that would get a sense of the different voices coming across.
Yes. Okay. Yes, absolutely. So that would that would be helpful just to give. And most people will complete that accurately. They'll just say, yes, I had some help, or no, I did it myself. There's not much. They won't be trying to, what's the word I want? Deconstruct that question in the sense of trying to figure out what you're trying to get at. They'll just say, oh yeah, I had some help, mum helped me, or whatever. And I think that will just help you to know how many had help and how many did it on themselves, and whether there was any differences.
Lovely, thank you very much.
No worries.
Does anybody else have any other questions? Just to finish off, if there isn't anybody else, I'd just quite like to ask you about how much NIHR is funding research into people with learning disabilities now. So much going on. I mean, I'm not expecting you to give me the statistics, but you.
No. But there is a bit more, and we do have. There's bits and pieces going on from the School of Social Care Research, which we are an intramural member of. So, but actually, there are a few others that will include people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in their research, but it's not huge. We will be the main part of the 6 intramural members. And in terms of the wider NIHR, it's very interesting. So the majority, obviously I'm just speaking off the top of the head, but my experience is that the majority of the work that is related to this is primarily so there will be some stuff around health, obviously, rather than social care. There is another stream that will support some social care funding, and they do want researchers to apply for social care related research to NIHR streams. But the majority of the work that I know that's funded through NIHR relates to people with intellectual disabilities who also have challenging behaviours that's considered challenging. So this might be the group that ends up in inpatient services or assessment and treatment units, or potentially offending and secure services. And there isn't that much that looks at, as I say, there's very little that looks at research. Now, we find it very hard to get research grant funding around social care, around the quality of services, around quality of life, well-being type areas. We almost always have to go to charities to get that funding. So most of our funding for that type of research comes from Nuffield or etc. So we could do with a little bit more. But of course, people think, well, it's not that big a population. But it's this point, it's my point about if we get it right, if we can get some of the things right for this group of people, then generally they'll work for everyone. So it's kind of always makes me a little bit sad that we can't get, people don't seem to see that.
What is the size of the population? How many people have learning disabilities?
So it's what is it at the minute? So it's just under it's not quite 1%. Autism is around 1% of the population, although it's depending on where you are in the world, of course, but in the UK it's usually about 1% of the population. Slightly less have an intellectual disability. The autism is more common. And then there's usually it's about what do we got? About between 8 and 15% of people with learning disabilities will show behaviours considered to be challenging, and that's the group that get most of the research funding. And in fact, that's the group that gets most of social care funding.
That's most interesting.
Yeah.
We are going to have to wind it up there, but we have before, and thank you so much. That was most illuminating, really interesting. Thank you very much, Julie. Really wonderful presentation, most interesting. And just before we go, we'd like to highlight a couple of other events that we've got coming up, online events. Later this month, we've got a project development, and we've also got 2 sessions in September, our 4th social care research webinar, and indeed on the 16th of September there is a 3-hour workshop on social care. So hopefully watch this space really about social care. It sounds very important to me. It's a huge population, isn't it, actually, of people.
Oh yeah, it's a lot of people in the end. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And as you say, who have not necessarily very positive life experiences.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, everybody.
If some people ask for some references, so perhaps if I send when the presentation goes out, or we can put them online, I'll put a little we can go send an email around to participants maybe, or whatever, to say here is the links to some of the people were asking, for example, the observational review and things like that. So I can send a couple of key references for people, and then anybody who wants to ask me for anything particular. So that was just the example. If we have time, my email is on the last page of the presentation. So that will be on the PowerPoint, the PDF, when it's sent around.
Thank you very much. That's
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Really
It's been my
helpful.
pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, bye.